Okay, here we go again. Okay, let's start where we left off. So sorry about that, guys. That was an interruption for someone to come look at my HVAC system and tell me that it was working well. So anyway, we just ended talking about me wanting you to do 2 jumps now. Jump 1 includes bending your knees and then jumping as fast as you can and moving from the down to the up in the jump as quickly as possible. So don't stay in transition long. Then jump 2 is bend your knees, hold at the bottom of that bend before you jump up for a few seconds, then jump up. You should be able to perform, jump 1 should be higher. Because less time in transition phase from eccentric to concentric equals more energy stored converted to energy used. So basically between those 2 phases, the eccentric phase, you store energy, the concentric phase, that energy is released. And in between the 2 phases, the transition phase from the down to the up in the jump, that energy that is stored stays. And if you don't release it quickly, then it dissipates. So think static energy to kinetic energy. And basically what plyometrics does is bridges the gap between speed and strength training. So you can actually train muscles to get more power, to become more powerful and quick. And you can train reactivity, and get better, faster, stronger just by doing plyometric exercises. So like examples of plyometrics, plyos exercises are jumps, hops, skips, etc. So we measure plyometric capacity with a vertical jump test. So in sport-specific training, we will use a combination of plyometric training. So that, think about it, as an athlete needs to run and jump and stop and start and cut in their sport, we'll use a combination of plyometric exercises, combo of plyos, with agility exercises and speed exercises, in addition to strength training, power training, to optimize performance in athletes. So basically, in addition to all of that, in addition to strength, power training, plyos, plyometrics, agility, speed training, core training, so think abdominal muscles, but not just abdominal muscles, back muscles, hip muscles are all muscles that you can train to improve stability, which facilitates gains in strength. And abdominal muscles, back muscles, they're a lot like type 1 muscle fibers, so they don't fatigue very easily, and they respond really well to multiple sets with high repetitions. So you can perform core exercises every day or with every training session, whereas other muscle groups like legs, like quads, hamstrings, chest, etc., require more rest between sessions. And other things like yoga and Pilates, Tai Chi, physio ball, those kinds of activities can also help stabilize the core. So all of those types of workouts can be added in either before, during, or after a training session in a gym. Can focus on abdominals, glutes, the hip girdle, paraspinal muscles, so the back muscles, anywhere that would stabilize muscles that you're using in other exercises. And by stabilizing core, you strengthen core and can also get more out of the other exercises. And that also helps prevent injury. As well, you strengthen your core, facilitate other lifts, but then improve stability, coordination, balance. All are important in sport. So all in all, core training, think sit-ups, think back exercises, think anything that would focus on the muscles listed here would be super helpful in maintaining proper core strength. When you're doing a squat particularly, you're supposed to hold your breath on the down and then leave it out on the up. And that in-breath helps stabilize your core. Well, the stronger those muscles are, the more stable your core is, and the more you'll be able to lift in the squat exercise. So doing core exercises, yes, trains your abdominal muscles, your back muscles, but it also helps facilitate and improve strength gains in other areas, particularly like I'm thinking squat. All of this we've kind of talked about up until this point is sport-specific training. I've kind of been mentioning this along the way, so we're not going to spend a ton of time here with the hope to finish up this second second half of the lecture in maybe 15 or 20 minutes, as opposed to the 45 or 50 minutes we spent on the first part before we got interrupted. Again, program design is pretty variable. It depends on the sport and depends on the needs of the athletes in that sport. If athletes are sprinting in their sport, then we'll be focusing on their ATP PCR system. If they're middle distance, think a couple hundred yards or more, we'll focus on anaerobic training. And if they're long distance athletes, then we'll focus on aerobic training. So sport specific metabolic systems, think about a soccer player or a basketball player or rugby, somebody who would be who would need all of this. Sport specific training focuses on all energy systems. Because at any given time, an athlete's going to need to tap into one energy system or another to compete. So ultimately, that's kind of the goal of sport-specific training, and we've been kind of talking about that along the way. Something called interval training is exactly what it sounds like. You basically modify a single workout. Think a run, a long-distance run. So say you wanted to run 3 miles, and you wanted to run 3 miles in 30 minutes. That's easily accomplished, I just made up a word, by running at a 10-minute mile pace. But maybe you needed to run that 3 miles in 20 minutes because you don't have 30 minutes. Well, if you can't run 3 miles at a consistent pace to finish it in 20 minutes, then what you can do is interval training. So you can toggle back and forth between high intensity and low intensity intervals of short bursts of high intensity with longer bouts of low intensity, easier to sustain in one session. And what that allows you to do is just accomplish more in less time. So you can do more total exercise, but by breaking it into particular bouts. And the vocabulary is the same as resistance training. So think sets, repetitions, time, distance, frequency, interval, and rest. So for example, one set of 6 repetitions of 400 meters, running 400 meters at 75 seconds, and then separated by 90 seconds of slow jogging. So you cut 15 seconds off of the high intensity exercise, but you run as fast as you can for 400 meters for 75 seconds. And then you take 90 seconds in between. And you do that 6 times. So this from 400 meters at 75 seconds to 90 seconds slow jog is 1 set. Or 1 repetition, excuse me. If this is 1 repetition, you do that 6 times, and that's 1 set. Set 2 is another 6 repetitions, but 800 meters at 180 seconds, and then 200 seconds jog. So there's 2 different examples of sets and repetitions to interval train. So you just kind of toggle back and forth between high intensity, say, and you can also break it down by time. So an interval, a set could be 30-second sprint, 1 minute jog. As opposed to, and you can do that interval for 20 minutes, which means you'll run farther in 20 minutes than if you just jogged for that 20 minutes. It's a really efficient way of getting a lot of work done in a little bit of time. I often do interval training when I don't have time in the morning, or because I'm not a morning person, I don't get up early enough to have a long time to work out. So I cut myself down to about 40 to 45 minutes, and I end up doing intervals on like my indoor cycling bike, or when I'm outside where I can. Obviously, I live in a city, so it's a little bit more difficult to kind of find places to sprint and run. You have to be careful because the sidewalks and roads are kind of busy and kind of beat up a little bit. But in general, it's pretty easy to do if you find a neighborhood, or if you find a track, like if you have a local high school or a local college, or you go to school where there's a track, either an indoor or an outdoor track. It can be really easy to do intervals, especially with regard to like walking and running. So that can apply to cycling, that can apply to swimming, that can apply to quite a bit. We talked about mode. Obviously, it can apply to a number of different sports. And what you can modify in any training session can be appropriate for any sport or activity. So the rate of exercise interval, the distance of the exercise interval. So think how often you're doing it, rate, distance, how far you're going, number of repetitions, the number of times you do that in sets per training session. Duration depends on the athletic's needs, or your own individual needs, or time constraints. Duration of active recovery and rest. There's Zoe shaking around in the background. The type of activity and frequency. These are all topics that we talked about in chapter 20. So I'm not going to spend much time here because we kind of already focused on what was most important. Remember, intensity is most important, but then you can kind of mess around with all of these different topics. We're going to talk about in the next couple of slides the most important here. So I think duration and distance is more practical. Intensity is the most important factor to focus on, but that depends on fitness and the number of sets and repetitions, etc. So duration and distance, if you are working at a particular intensity, you're going to train a particular energy system. If you're working at 90 to almost 100% of max intensity, then you're going to be training your ATP PCR system. If you're working between 80 to 95%, then you're training anaerobic energy systems. And aerobic then have to get even lower. So again, remember, the lower the intensity, the longer that you can sustain this activity. Low intensity is more sustainable than high. And remember, if you're training at your 1 repetition maximum, you should only be able to lift that 1 rep max 1 time. So if you want to gain endurance and you want to work, you have to work at a lower intensity and then just perform more repetitions. So in terms of like anaerobic and aerobic exercise, that power training, depending on what your goals are, if you want to train to become more anaerobically fit, you're going to train in these windows. So to your interval intensity, remember, intensity is one of the most important. Intensity is the most important factor in exercise training. And if you want to focus on anaerobic power, then you need to stay here in this range, 80 to 98% of max exercise intensity. And if it's aerobic, then remember, 2 to 3 minutes is the maximum aerobic effort. And if you want to become anaerobic, then you're training in, anaerobic training occurs in 10 seconds to 1.5 minutes. So if you wanted to train your ATP PCR system, you would want to train occurs in the first 30 seconds of exercise. And then 30 seconds to 1.5 minutes trains predominantly anaerobic glycolysis at the listed intensities. If you can sustain the exercise for more than 30 seconds, then you're not training as heavily your ATP-PCR system. You still will, but not to the maximum extent. Aerobically, we talked about target heart rate range back in chapter 20, so go back and review that quickly. Percent heart rate max is a better index of physiological stress as opposed to thinking like anaerobic intensity. So when you're working in those ranges, they're very similar, but ATP-PCR training is 90 to 100% of heart rate max, and heart rate max, percent heart rate max training is more individually applicable because everyone's heart rate max and heart rate rest, thus heart rate reserve, is different. So it's a little bit easier to tailor a program to an individual and their needs based on heart rate training. It's again an easy measurement, so it's not difficult to prescribe. And heart rate monitors can be really helpful in monitoring heart rate during a workout when you don't have something else like the ability to easily take heart rate measurements. Heart rate monitors can be expensive, they can be cheaper, they can be moderately priced. It just depends on what you're looking for. I've seen some heart rate monitors that also have a GPS tracker in them so they can track elevation, all kinds of fancy equipment out there. Like think Garmin watches can track heart rate, but also elevation and distance and things like that. So there's a lot of pieces of equipment out there on the market that can really do some good stuff. The distance of an interval is completely determined by the requirements of your activity. So sprint training, you won't sprint for longer than 200 meters if you're trying or up to 400 meters if you're trying to train for a sprint. You shouldn't be able to sustain a sprint for a long period of time. But if you're training for distance, then you train longer. So think about the principle of specificity. Your body will respond to what you ask it to do, to its demands. So the distance of an interval completely depends on the goal of the program. And the more you want to train your ATP-PCR system or your anaerobic system, the shorter the distance of the interval should be. But if you think about it, runners train both, because at the end of a distance run, they sprint. In the last 100 meters or so, their last even half a mile sometimes of a race, depending on how long it is, there's just a sprint to the finish. So oftentimes, if you're an elite athlete, you're going to be training for both distance, but also mixing in some sprint training to help you in the last bit of the race. And then the rest sets and repetitions are completely sport specific. Short, intense intervals, you'll be able to do more repetitions and sets, but longer intervals, obviously because of time constraints and fatigue, fewer repetitions and sets. So again, this is going to be a little bit broad because it'll completely depend on the needs of the athlete and the sport, and the time constraints for that person. And the duration of rest interval completely depends on how rapidly the athlete recovers. So a lot of times we can train an athlete to recover faster by reducing rest interval, but there's a very fine line between reducing rest interval to minimize recovery, to train recovery faster, and fatiguing our athlete. And that can be tracked over time by heart rate recovery. Remember from chapter 21, no, it's chapter 11, heart rate recovery in a trained person is faster than the recovery heart rate in untrained. So tracking heart rate recovery, again, that's why it says it's fitness and age dependent. Tracking heart rate recovery can be a really good way to see how quickly the heart rate comes down from the exercising heart rate, and is basically an indication of the athlete's readiness for the next set, or the next interval. And there's also periods of active recovery. So think of like active recovery being a jog in between intervals of sprints. So that's an active recovery where heart rate will decline, but not decline toward as close to rest as if someone had stopped jogging altogether. The activity during the rest interval can be complete rest, or it can just be a decrease in exercise intensity. And that is also pretty variable depending on the fitness of your athlete. The intensity of the intensity of the workout and the restoration can decline with better fitness. So swimmers do like land training versus pool training to train certain types of fitness so that they're better in the pool. But like for land training, a slow or rapid walk or jog would be like an active recovery. And in a swim, it would be just a slower swim or complete rest on the side of the pool. Frequency of training, how many times per week? The more elite you are, the more times per week you will train. Typically team sports train at least 2 to 4 times per week, and this is outside of their sport. So they're practicing on their athletic field, and then the team sports, how often they come into the gym completely depends on where they're at in their season. If it's off season, they'll come into the gym 5 to 7 days a week. If it's preseason, 2 to 4 times a week. If it's during season, same time. Competition season, maybe once or twice a week, just to maintain the gains that they've incurred over the season. And then in the beginning of postseason, they take off completely and then come back into the gym 5 to 7 days a week to get to either, rehab injuries that incurred there during the season, or just to get back into training to get bigger, better, faster, stronger for the next season. So that can depend on the purpose of the training as well. So, for example, athletes in off season train 5 to 7 days a week, but preseason, season, likely 2 to 4 days a week. In competition, so postseason, 1 to 2 days a week. And then rest, recover after postseason until off-season training begins again to allow for injury, recovery, repair, etc. So a lot going on, and a lot of variability. It's really difficult to prescribe exercise for someone, mostly because it's just so broad. It's like trying to pick a topic for a presentation when the instructor says, just go pick something that you're interested in, if that doesn't sound familiar. So prescribing exercise to an individual, again, to start, just get them moving more if they've never trained before. When it comes to exercise training in athletes, you need to be more trained. So think like training certifications, so think ACSM, NSCA, NASM, training certifications can train you to learn to train athletes, clinical populations, etc. And the ACSM is the American College of Sports Medicine. NSCA are where my certifications come from, the National Strength and Conditioning Association. I'm CSCS certified, so Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist. NASM is the National Academy of Sports Medicine. These are like a list of the top in the nation. You can get a training certification online. You can do a weekend certification. There's some cheaper ones that aren't as good. But if you want to ever train individuals professionally, those 3 academies are really the best of the best. And the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, is one of the best to train towards clinical population training. So think physical therapy, rehab, clinical populations like diabetes, cardiovascular disease. The National Strength and Conditioning Association is where you would go for a CSCS certification, Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist, which is the top strength and conditioning certification in the nation. Or they also have a CPT, which is Certified Personal Trainer. Those two certifications are both top notch. National Academy of Sports Medicine, same thing. So all of them are really good training certifications to have or to attain if you're interested in training some kind of population. But I think NSCA would be like sports specific training, but whereas ACSM is more broad clinical population training and things like that. So just for general health and exercise. The college, ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, also publishes a book every couple years that's updated every couple years with guidelines for training. So you can find that guidelines book on anywhere, any book website, Amazon, for example. That I have a book in my possession on my own. So it is a really good book to refer to. It kind of gives you an idea of how to properly exercise, test, and prescribe. It's a wonderful asset to have. So in saying that, I am going to save this and then post this 1B lecture to e-learning so you have access to it. And right now, I think I'm going to go start fall break. So I hope you all are doing well and have a great break, and I will see you soon.